Okay. Okay. All right. Let's get started, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? I want to make sure everyone can hear me okay. Think everyone can hear me. Looks like everyone can hear me. Okay, cool. Happy Saturday afternoon. Here in beautiful. I'm hearing my voice come back at myself. I need to make that not happen. Um, but hey, with the Memorial Day weekend underway, it feels like the perfect moment to have a conversation about morals. Because this weekend is about remembering people who stood for something, right? People who gave their lives for something bigger than themselves. And if there's ever a good time to talk about morals, about what we believe in and what truly matters, it's right now. Morals. Remember morals? Like we used to talk about morals, didn't we? It doesn't seem that complicated, morals, but when we've somehow forgotten about them, it seems like it's necessary for us to go down a cul-de-sac to remind ourselves about what these things actually are. I mean, we all learned about morals, didn't we? Right, from those old stories we heard as kids, uh, fairy tales, Disney movies. The stuff that's supposed to teach you right and wrong, uh, kindness from cruelty, honesty from deception, and we didn't just learn them; we loved them. We teach them to our kids. It's part of the basic package of childhood. But what's weird is that as adults, we seem to just throw all that stuff away. It's almost like we got older and decided morals were childish and naive. Like those simple lessons about honesty and fairness and courage don't really apply once you're out in the real world. Now, let me ask you something. When did this happen? When did we decide that moral clarity was a sign of intellectual immaturity? Because that's what we've done, isn't it? Like we've created this weird culture where the smartest thing you can say about any moral situation is, well, it's complicated. And if you dare suggest that some things are actually pretty straightforward, that lying is wrong, that cruelty is bad, that courage matters, suddenly you're the naive one. You're the one who doesn't understand nuance. But here's what I think happened. Somewhere along the way, we confused sophistication with paralysis. We started thinking that being smart meant never taking a clear moral stance. We began to believe that true wisdom lay in seeing all sides of every issue and finding the gray area in every black and white situation. And look, I mean, I'm not saying nuance doesn't matter. Need a Kleenex. But there's a difference between understanding complexity and using complexity as an excuse to avoid making moral judgments altogether. There's a difference between um, wisdom and what I call sophisticated cowardice. Like, let me give you an example. Like, remember, like the story of Cinderella? At its core, it's about a young woman who faces cruelty and responds with kindness, who chooses honesty over deception, even when that deception would be easier, who believes that goodness matters, even when the world seems to reward the opposite. That's not a complicated moral lesson, right? It's a profound one. The fact it's simple doesn't make it simplistic. But somehow, as adults, we've decided that um, believing in the moral framework of Cinderella makes us unsophisticated. We roll our eyes at the idea that kindness triumphs over cruelty, that truth wins over lies, that goodness has its own power. We call it fairy tale thinking, and we don't mean it as a compliment, do we? But what if fairy tale thinking is exactly what we need right now? The problem with abandoning moral clarity when you lose those basics, when you decide that they're somehow not sophisticated enough, what do you replace them with? You replace them with this weird kind of moral relativism. Everything becomes gray, everything becomes complex. You start saying things like, well, yeah, but it's complicated. Both sides have their problems. And you know what that does? It gives you permission not to make hard decisions. It lets you step away from moral responsibility. It allows you to feel sophisticated while actually being passive. That's what it allows. Um, I reference Hannah Arendt a lot in my writing. Um, and she wrote about how totalitarian movements succeed, not by convincing people to believe in evil, but by destroying people's capacity to distinguish between good and evil in the first place. They flood the zone, as Steve Bannon famously, set that phrase, with confusion, with false equivalencies, with claims everything is equally corrupt, equally meaningless, equally complicated. This is a familiar feature of our modern discourse. So when everything is equally bad, nothing is particularly bad. When every politician is equally corrupt, then open corruption becomes just another policy position. When every truth claim is equally suspect, then obvious lies become matters of opinion. This is how we end up with grown adults, intelligent, thoughtful people who can't seem to tell the difference between someone lying about their health condition and someone openly dismantling our constitutional democracy, which is happening right now in front of our eyes. But we treat them like they're the same. We shrug and say, everyone lies, both sides have their problems. But that's just the false equivalence, fallacy, dressed up as sophistication. That's not wisdom, that's giving up. What does wisdom actually look like? Wisdom is being able to hold complexity and clarity at the same time. It's understanding that the world is complicated while still being able to recognize that some things are clearly right and some things are clearly wrong. Think about it this way. We know that jaywalking and murder are both illegal. They're both illegal, both of them. But we don't pretend they're equally serious crimes. We know that forgetting your anniversary and having an affair both hurt your spouse, but we don't act like they're equivalent betrayals. We make distinctions. We understand gradations. We exercise judgment. But when it comes to politics, suddenly our brains just switch off. It's like we're so exhausted from having to make moral judgments every day that we decide to stop making them at all. And that's dangerous. That's how democracies die, not with dramatic moments of crisis, but with slow creeping moral numbness, with the gradual erosion of our capacity to say clearly and without apology, this is right and this is wrong. And this matters beyond politics, because morals aren't just about how we vote or which policies we support. They're about how we live, like how we trust each other, how we understand our own purpose and meaning. When we abandon moral clarity, we don't just become worse citizens, we become worse people. We lose our ability to navigate relationships honestly. We lose our capacity for genuine friendship, because friendship requires the ability to call out bad behavior when we see it. We lose our sense of personal integrity because integrity requires clear standards to maintain. I know a lot of people right now are struggling with what you might call decision fatigue. Everything feels impossible to navigate. Every choice feels morally fraught. Every relationship potentially compromised. And I think a lot of this comes from having abandoned the simple moral frameworks that could actually guide us through complexity. Think about workplace situations where someone takes credit for your work. We've all seen this happen. And what do people usually say? It's complicated. Maybe they don't realize what they're doing. Maybe it's not that big of a deal. Maybe I'm being overly sensitive. What would an 8-year-old say if another kid were taking credit for their art project? We'd say that taking credit for someone else's work is stealing and that they should speak up about it. So why is it more complicated when adults do it? The truth is it's not more complicated. We've just convinced ourselves that it is because we're afraid of the consequences of moral clarity. We're afraid of conflict, of being labeled judgmental, of having to actually stand for something. The consequences of moral confusion are always worse than the consequences of moral clarity. Because when you don't know what you stand for, you'll fall for anything. When you can't distinguish between right and wrong, you become vulnerable to every form of manipulation, every false equivalence, every sophisticated sounding argument that's designed to paralyze you rather than illuminate the truth. So when we talk about this, like, we have to recognize that this moral confusion is being weaponized against us because there are people who benefit from our inability to make clear moral distinctions. There are systems of power that depend on this confusion. This is the situation that we find ourselves in. And let's think about how this corruption works in practice. It doesn't announce itself as corruption. It presents itself as complexity. You don't understand the full situation. There are competing interests at play. It's more nuanced than it appears. The corrupt rarely defend corruption directly. They defend the impossibility of defining corruption clearly. This is what happens with authoritarianism. Authoritarians don't usually say, I want to be dictator. They say the situation is too complex for normal democratic processes. They say emergency measures require setting aside usual constraints. They say you can't apply your simple moral frameworks to these unprecedented circumstances. And if you've already been trained to believe that moral clarity is naive, that sophisticated people always see complexity, that taking a clear stance is intellectually unsophisticated, well, then you're already halfway into accepting authoritarianism. You're halfway there. Congratulations. This is why I think our culture's abandonment of moral clarity isn't just a philosophical problem. It's a practical vulnerability. It's made us sitting ducks for anyone who wants to exploit our fear of being seen as unsophisticated. Now, let me address something directly because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, but Mike, what about tolerance? What about understanding? What different cultures, different perspectives? Isn't moral clarity just another form of moral imperialism? I mean, this gets to something really important about how moral reasoning actually works. True moral reasoning isn't about imposing one set of cultural practices on everyone else. It's about identifying the underlying principles that make human flourishing possible across different cultural contexts. And here's the thing: those principles are remarkably consistent across cultures throughout history. Every human society has some version of don't lie. Every human society has some version of don't be unnecessarily cruel. Every human society has some understanding of fairness, of reciprocity, of the importance of keeping promises. The specific applications vary, but the underlying moral intuitions are remarkably universal. When we say it's all relative, we're not being sophisticated. We're ignoring the overwhelming evidence that human beings, regardless of culture, share fundamental moral intuitions. We're pretending that existence of some cultural variation means there are no universal principles at all. But that's like saying that because different languages use different words for water, the concept of water is culturally relative. It's nonsense. The surface differences don't eliminate the underlying reality. And here's something else: the people who most often invoke cultural relativism to justify moral confusion aren't usually the people from different cultures. They're usually people from our own culture who want to avoid making difficult moral judgments about behavior they know is wrong. They know I mean, I don't want to go down that cul-de-sac. We should talk about that at some point, but This is a source of massive, massive moral confusion, particularly on the far left. Um, and I've noticed that when someone is being systematically cruel, the people around them suddenly become very interested in cultural relativism, in the complexity of the situation, in the impossibility of making judgments. But the victims of that cruelty, they usually know exactly what's happening to them. They usually have a very clear sense of right and wrong. Moral clarity isn't imperialism. It's solidarity with people who are being harmed by those who benefit from moral confusion. So let's get practical. How do we actually recover moral clarity? How do we rebuild our capacity to distinguish right from wrong without falling into moral rigidity and self righteousness? Well, first, we have to remember that moral clarity isn't the same thing as moral certainty. You can be clear about principles while remaining open to new information, to change circumstances, to the possibility that you might be wrong about specific applications. For example, I can be absolutely clear that lying is generally wrong while still understanding that there might be specific circumstances, like protecting innocent people from persecution, where telling the truth would cause greater harm than telling a lie. The principle doesn't change, but its application requires judgment. This is what I mean when I say that morals are simple but not simplistic. The basic principles are clear. Their application in complex situation requires wisdom. Second, I would say that we have to stop being afraid of being called judgmental, because here's a secret: moral judgments is literally what moral reasoning is. You can't have morals without making judgments about behavior. The question isn't whether to make judgments, it's whether to make them thoughtfully or it's whether to make them thoughtfully or carelessly, with compassion or with cruelty, based on principles or based on convenience. Good people make moral judgments all the time. They judge that kindness is better than cruelty, that honesty is better than deception, that courage is better than cowardice. The difference between good people and self righteous people isn't that good people don't make judgments, it's that they apply those same standards to themselves and they remain open to being corrected when they're wrong. Third, we have to reclaim the language of morality from those who would use it as a weapon. Too often, moral language gets hijacked by people who want to impose their will on others rather than genuinely grapple with right and wrong. But the solution isn't to abandon moral language altogether, it's to use it more carefully, more thoughtfully, more humbly. And fourth, this is crucial, we have to remember that moral clarity is not a destination, but a practice. It's not something you can achieve once and then maintain automatically. It's it's something you have to choose again and again, in situation after situation, sometimes in the face of enormous pressure to compromise or look the other way. Which brings me back to the fairy tales. Um, because you know what fairy tales actually teach us? They don't teach us that life is simple or that good always triumphs over evil without struggle. They teach us that struggle between good and evil is ongoing, that it requires courage and persistence, and that ordinary people, people like us, have the power to choose which side they're on. Cinderella doesn't become good by accident. She chooses kindness when cruelty would be easier. She chooses honesty when deception would be safer. She chooses help or she chooses to help others when helping herself would be more practical. These are active moral choices made again and again in the face of real difficulty and real consequences. The same is true for us. Moral clarity isn't something that happens to us, it's something we choose. And we have to choose it not just once, but every day, in every situation, when we're tempted to take the easy way out, to look the other way, to pretend that wrong is right and that right is impossible to determine. Now, let me talk about why this matters right now in this specific moment in history, because we're not just dealing with abstract moral questions, we're dealing with concrete threats to the foundations of democratic life. It's funny, we talk all the time about protecting democracy, about defending it, preserving it, but we forget something really basic. Democracy isn't just rules and elections and institutions. Democracy is a moral project. It depends on us actually believing in the morals we pretend to teach our kids: honesty, fairness, courage. Without those things, democracy doesn't work, because democracy requires us to make distinctions, to make judgments, to say clearly, this is acceptable and this is not. When we lose our capacity for moral clarity, we lose our capacity for basic democratic citizenship. Because democratic citizenship isn't just about voting, it's about the ongoing work of distinguishing between leaders who serve the public good and leaders who serve only themselves. It's about recognizing the difference between policies you disagree with and actions that undermine the very possibility of democratic disagreement. And right now, we need that capacity more than ever, because we're facing challenges that require us to make clear moral distinctions, not just political calculations. We're dealing with people and movements that benefit from our confusion, that exploit our reluctance to make judgments, that weaponize our sophistication against us. When someone attempts to overturn an election, we can't treat that as a policy disagreement. That is an attack on democracy itself. When someone systematically lies to the public, that's not just political spin, it's an assault on the shared reality that democratic discourse requires to function. When someone uses their office to enrich themselves and their family, that's not just poor judgment, it's corruption that undermines the entire system. These aren't complicated moral questions requiring nuanced analysis and law degrees. These are basic moral questions requiring clear answers. And our inability to give those clear answers, our insistence that everything is complicated, that both sides have their problems, that we can't really know what's in someone's heart, that's not sophistication, that's surrender. Let me be even more specific about what this looks like in practice. When we see someone defying Supreme Court orders, we don't need a complex analysis of constitutional law to know what's wrong. When we see someone accepting foreign gifts while in office, we don't need a graduate degree in ethics to recognize corruption. When we see someone running criminal enterprises from the White House, we don't need to both sides our way to understanding. These things are wrong. Clearly, obviously, undeniably wrong. And the fact that we've been trained to see moral clarity as naive doesn't change that. It just makes us vulnerable to manipulation by people who count on our confusion. Look, I understand the impulse towards complexity. The world is complicated. People are complicated. Even good people sometimes do bad things, and even bad people sometimes do good things. But here's what I've learned: acknowledging complexity doesn't require abandoning clarity. You can hold both. You can understand that someone might have complicated motivations while still recognizing that their actions are harmful. You can acknowledge that a situation has multiple factors while still being clear about which factors matter most. You can appreciate nuance while still maintaining your principles. The problem, I think, comes when we use complexity as an excuse for paralysis. When we say it's too complicated to judge, what we're really saying is, I'm too afraid to judge. And that fear, that moral cowardice disguised as sophistication, is what allows terrible things to flourish. Because here's the thing about evil: it doesn't announce itself as evil. It presents itself as complexity. It says, you don't understand the full picture, it says. The situation is more nuanced than it appears. It says, who are you to judge? And if we've already decided that making moral judgments is naive, that sophisticated people always see the complexity, that taking a clear stance is intellectually unsophisticated, well, then we've already lost, haven't we? We've already given evil exactly what it needs to operate freely, our moral confusion. Sorry, sinuses are acting up today, as they often do. A genetic inheritance, apparently. My father also had very overactive sinuses. There's good news, though. We can choose something different. We can choose to remember those basic lessons. We can choose to embrace clarity again. And that's not really, well, that's actually what rebellion is, right? That's the ultimate rebellion, the decision to not forget what you already know is true. That doesn't mean becoming rigid or self-righteous. It doesn't mean losing our capacity for nuance or appreciation for complexity. It means having the courage to say that some things are clearly right and some things are clearly wrong, and that we have a responsibility to act on that clarity. Let me tell you what this looks like in practice, right? It means it means calling lies lies instead of misstatements or alternative facts. It means recognizing corruption as corruption, not as business as usual or the way the game is played. It means distinguishing between politicians you disagree with and politicians who attack the foundations of democratic governance itself. It means having the courage to say that not all political positions are equally valid, that not all truth claims are equally credible, that not all leaders are equally fit for office. It means being willing to be called naive, unsophisticated, judgmental, and understanding that these accusations are often weapons used by people who benefit from moral confusion. Most importantly, it means remembering that moral clarity is not a luxury we can afford only in times of peace and prosperity. It's precisely in times of crisis, when everything seems to be falling apart, that we most need the courage to hold on to our basic principles, to resist the temptation to compromise our way into irrelevance. And let me address something that I think stops a lot of people from embracing moral clarity: the fear of being wrong. We've been told that certainty is dangerous, and it is. That humility requires constant doubt. It's true. That but there's this belief that moral confidence is just arrogance in disguise. I mean, a lot of people think I'm very arrogant. That everything I'm saying is very arrogant. Who am I to be like judging everyone like this? But there's a difference between moral clarity and moral arrogance. Moral clarity says, based on everything I know and understand, this is wrong. Moral arrogance says, I could never be wrong about anything. Moral clarity remains open to new information while maintaining firm principles. Moral arrogance refuses to consider that it might need to update its understanding. And I don't think I've ever had any issue admitting when I'm wrong. I've done plenty of wrong things. I mean, I have plenty of things that I'm, ashamed of having done throughout my life, and that doesn't undermine my ability to have moral calculus about what's happening in the world around me. Nor does it, nor do your moral failings limit your ability to try and act more morally every moment of every day going forward. We want to grow as people. So you can be absolutely clear that cruelty is wrong, while remaining open to learning about situations where you might have misunderstood what was happening. You can be certain that honesty matters while acknowledging that sometimes you might have been misinformed about the facts. The clarity is about your principles, not about your perfect understanding of every situation. And here's something else: being wrong occasionally doesn't invalidate the importance of moral clarity. It just means you're human. The alternative, never taking moral stands because you might be wrong, isn't wisdom. It's paralysis. And paralysis in the face of clear wrongdoing is complicity. Now, I want to talk about something that might be very uncomfortable for some of you. Because when I talk about moral clarity, I'm not just talking about other people, I'm talking about us, about me, about the ways we've all participated in this culture of moral confusion. How many times have you seen something you knew was wrong and convinced yourself it was complicated? How many times have you witnessed cruelty and told yourself you didn't have enough information to judge? How many times have you heard lies and called them spin because it was easier than confronting the reality of deception? I've done all of these things. We all have. The culture of moral confusion isn't something that happens to us. It's something we participate in, often because it feels safer, easier, more socially acceptable than taking clear moral stands. The cost of that participation is higher than the cost of moral clarity. When we abandon our ability to distinguish right from wrong, we don't just harm ourselves, we harm everyone around us. We become part of the problem. We enable the very systems and behaviors we claim to oppose. And the people who pay the highest price aren't us. It's the people who are being harmed while we debate whether their suffering is complicated enough to require our judgment. So this isn't about political analysis or philosophical theory. This is about moral responsibility. This is about whether we're going to be people who stand for something or people who stand for nothing because everything is too complicated to understand. This is about whether we're going to teach our children that moral clarity matters or that sophistication requires moral paralysis. This is about whether we're going to be citizens who can distinguish between democracy and its enemies, or sophisticated observers who can't tell the difference between governance and exploitation. Those fairy tales we learned as children, they weren't teaching us about a world that doesn't exist. They were teaching us about a world that exists everywhere, always. The world where people choose between kindness and cruelty, between honesty and deception, between courage and cowardice. The choice between good and evil isn't some ancient mythological concept. It's a choice we make every day in every interaction, in every decision about whether to speak truth or remain silent, whether to stand up for what's right or look the other way. And yes, the world is more complicated than fairy tales. But the fundamental moral framework they teach us, that there is such a thing as right and wrong, that our choices matter, that courage is required to do good, that framework isn't childish, it's foundational. Without it, we're lost. Without it, we become exactly what the manipulators and authoritarians need us to become. People who can't distinguish between good and evil, people who mistake paralysis for wisdom, people who think moral clarity is naive. But we don't have to be those people. We can choose to be something different. We can choose to remember that 2 + 2 = 4. Not because mathematics is simple, but because some truths are reliable regardless of who wants to complicate them. We can choose to remember that there are 24 hours in a day, not because time is uncomplicated, but because some realities persist despite attempts to confuse them. And we can choose to remember that doing what's right isn't complicated, it's just hard. But the good news is, it's always worth it. So maybe the most revolutionary thing we could do right now isn't to come up with some complex new political theory or philosophical framework. Maybe it's just remembering the simple moral lessons we already know. Maybe it's admitting that our kids understand something we've forgotten, that clarity matters, that honesty matters, that kindness matters, that courage matters. Because if we can't do that, if we can't keep acting like morals are too complicated to bother with, then we're not going to be able to fix anything. We're just going to keep sliding further into confusion, into cynicism, into a place where we can't tell right from wrong, where everything feels equally hopeless, equally broken, and equally meaningless. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can choose something different. We can choose to remember these basic lessons. We can choose to embrace clarity again. And that's really all rebellion is. Just the decision to not forget what we already know is true. So, yeah, let's talk about morals. Let's talk about them clearly, honestly, openly. And maybe, just maybe, if we start remembering those simple lessons, we'll find that the answers aren't as complicated as we've been pretending that they are. Morals. Remember them? So maybe I should now, after I've got that off my chest, do some questions. Problem is, though, I don't know how to check for questions. How do I get the chat up? Oh, I have questions now. Oh, there we go. I have the chat now. Now I have the chat. So does anybody want to ask any questions or bring up any comments? I'm happy to address now in the waning moments of my unfortunately congested selves. Oh, let me see here. Is the Constitution, is the law of the land as fungible as 2 + 2 = 4 was in 1984? Yeah, sure, why not, right? The Constitution is the law of the land. Who disagrees? Who disagrees with that? Have them come forth. I'd like to talk to them. They seem like I mean, potentially domestic enemies. Any other questions, comments? Anybody wants me to address? Or I can wrap this up early. There may have been other comments or questions. I can't see the chat that was going on before. Yeah, I mean, one additional thing I just want to like say is, and this is obviously related to the piece that I put out today on the moral emergency that we cannot feel, right? There, I mean, there is like an empathetic frame that we can come at people here and their inability to sort of like spend the time. They don't have the time to understand the complexity of what's going on. But I think my response to this consistently is that these things are actually not that complicated. That what's actually going on is we're being sold a bill of goods about the complex nuance of constitutional theory, of the Foreign Emoluments Clause, for example, when it's really just fucking simple. It's a simple, straightforward thing. The Qatari jet is an emolument, as I said yesterday, and there's no real like question of that. So that's my once again rehashed thought on that. But I don't know. I think I mean, hopefully that was I mean, that was a monologue for you guys there. My thoughts on the importance of morals and fairy tales. We need to take morals more seriously as a society. We become a very immoral society. Um, and I'm going to be talking a lot more about morals because we need them apparently. And I truly do think that like we could learn a lot from fairy tales. Thanks everybody for joining me today. Had a little bit more of a, I don't know if this is like a, I don't know. I hope I'm not getting a head cold. I hope this is just my overactive sinuses, but I'm starting to worry. This could be a head cold. But this was fun. Enjoyed talking to you guys today. Check out the piece that I put out today. It is paywalled for 5 days. It's part of my 5 day sort of the tentpole pieces, the moral emergency we cannot feel. But for those who don't can't afford, I understand. If times are tough, it will be a free article in 5 days. That's true of all of my paywalled content. It becomes free 5 days after I post it, and that's like a commitment that I'm continuing to honor. So, but I do give my paying subscribers early access to these pieces. So, anyways, happy Memorial Day weekend, everybody. Look forward to chatting again. I'll probably do another one of these tomorrow if I have nothing else to do. So, thanks everybody, and peace.